Professor Richard Neustadt of the Kennedy School, who would like to say a few words before we begin.
I rise to make a sad announcement. David Lord Harlech, who's been the chairman of the Senior Advisory Committee of the Institute, and a member of that committee since the Institute was founded, was killed last Friday in an automobile accident. And since this is the first function that involves the Institute since his death, Jonathan thought it appropriate for me to say a word or two about him, so that we would mark his passing, because he deserves that. David Ormsby Gore, as was a friend as a young man of Jack Kennedy's in London. Entered Parliament. Did very well as a junior minister in the Foreign Office. As a Tory in the Macmillan government. In an inspired move, Macmillan sent him over to Washington when Kennedy became president, and he was a most effective ambassador, effective for the British and very helpful to the American government too. He was close to the president, and after the president's death, the family asked him to interest himself in this undertaking here. And David did so with enthusiasm, energy, wit, and constant helpfulness. He was, I suppose, the person who was most constant in reminding us that the Institute of Politics was the branch of this school set up essentially for students, and with particular attention to undergraduates, and that its task, not being part of the college and being outside the curriculum of the college, was to do extracurricular things that aroused, maintained, nurtured the interests of students in politics. David never allowed that to be forgotten. His energy and tact were useful to me at the start, have been constantly useful to Jonathan, and we are very sorry that we shall not have him anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Neustadt. I'd just like to make two other quick announcements, two invitations, as it were, before we begin. The first is to invite you all to take one of our spring study groups, and you can do so by registering across the way in the Institute of Politics living room tonight through Tuesday. There are study groups not only taught by the 6 fellows who you'll meet tonight, but also by other people from the Boston area. There's a description and a brochure and registration forms in the living room. And the second invitation is to stay with us after this panel. We'll be having a reception in the first floor conference room with beer and soda and so forth, and a chance for you to come up and talk to the fellows who you'll be meeting. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce the director of the Institute of Politics, Jonathan Moore.
Thank you very much, Peter. It is always a pleasure to welcome you, the audience, to this occasion, which is one of my special favorites among the various programs which the Institute puts on for the Harvard community. The idea is, strangely enough, that we welcome the newly arrived fellows of the Institute of Politics by giving them the privilege of spilling their guts in public. That is to say, we have very interesting, compelling people who come to the Institute for the short period of one semester from various walks of political life, from various activities in political life, and they spend that all too brief time at the Institute doing some teaching, doing some studying, being accessible to and involved with students and faculty and staff and each other, and hopefully sharing something that they've learned in their experience in American politics or abroad, politics broadly defined, and maybe taking something away with them after they've left, which is of value to them in their continued contribution to American political life. The idea then of this occasion is to see if we can encourage them to share some of their feelings about their careers, their experiences, their motivations in public life, just on the eve of starting this short visit with us here at Harvard. The idea is that we will ask each of the newly arrived fellows to take 5 minutes or so to tell us a little bit about themselves in the spirit that I have described. And then, after each of them has had a chance to do that, we will open the evening up for questions and answers. And you, people in the audience, are encouraged to ask them both about their careers, their experiences, but also about policy matters which you may be interested in that they have alluded to in their remarks. Then, as Peter Gelfman has already said, we will adjourn to the Institute of Politics for some more informal continuation of the discussion. So we will begin by asking Dan Whitehurst, who is sitting all the way over to the right, to start. Mr. Whitehurst is up until very recently the mayor of Fresno, California, and he will be leading a student study group this semester at the Institute entitled California Politics. Dan.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good evening, everybody. Let me begin by thanking you for coming by to hear us spill our guts this evening. I should tell you that I've just completed 2 terms as the mayor of Fresno, and I should further tell you that the year before I was elected mayor, Fresno was rated an all-American city, and in my last year as mayor, Fresno was rated the least livable city in the United States. Obviously, I can't be accused of having been a do-nothing mayor, and I think it was on the basis of my accomplishments that I am here with you. When I should also tell you, I guess, that I was the youngest mayor in the country, and that might be something that we'll want to chat about. I see political aspirations all around me, and you might want to chat about that. When I ran for mayor, I ran on a program of promoting drinking in the streets and big funerals. Now, perhaps that calls for some explanation. My family, I grew up in a small town, and my father was the town undertaker. And then we moved to the big city of Fresno, and we had the chance to observe something, and that was that in the small towns you had bigger funerals, and in the big cities fewer people came to the funerals. And so I had to spend some time thinking about that. But I guess what finally occurred to me was that in a small town everybody is somebody. In a bigger city, that's not necessarily the case. It's ironic that the more people you have around, the more loneliness can exist and a weaker sense of community. So I thought it might be that maybe a goal that I would promote in my city was bigger funerals, and by that I meant to build a sense of community so that we'd create an environment in which everybody would be somebody and there would be a sense of connectedness among us. Frankly, I regard this as one of the major problems that our country is facing today is the decline in sense of community and also the loss of human scale in our communities. How does drinking in the streets relate to that? Well, I went to Catholic college, and drinking in the streets just seems like the way things should be. I don't know. One of the things we came up with as a way of promoting a sense of community was what started off as kind of a little frivolous program that turned out to be the basis of a whole new approach to our policing program, and that's we started a block party program where we encouraged neighbors all over the city. We encouraged neighborhoods to get together and have social events. So we'd have an annual block party weekend, and it turned out we'd have hundreds of neighborhoods all having these neighborhood gatherings all in the same weekend. And it kind of struck a chord. It was, I think people were feeling that need to develop a stronger sense of community. And so that was an idea that we came up with that led to some other things that were very positive. The question comes up for people like us, I guess, why did you get into politics? I've asked myself that question, and I remember one night specifically when I asked the question of myself. The night I was sworn in as mayor, I was the chief administrative officer asked if he could meet with me privately. I said, sure. He informed me then that all federal law enforcement agencies had cut off communications with the Fresno Police Department, that FBI, Secret Service, Drug Enforcement Administration, all of these alcohol, tobacco, firearms had all cut off communications because the Fresno Police Department was protecting organized criminal activities in the community, narcotics trafficking, gambling, prostitution, so on. You know, here I'm just trying to have drinking in the streets and cut ribbons and so on, and here I find out that we've got a fairly serious corruption problem in our department. That's when I asked myself, why did I get into politics? I won't bore you with the story tonight, but the story is one that I think you might find interesting if we have the time some night to chat about it. But one of the even though my city was rated the least livable in the country by a survey last year, our police department was rated the best in the country in terms of community relations and involvement of private citizens in the matter of public safety. So that was the silver lining to an otherwise cloudy year that we had. I'll make one final comment, and that is it's especially meaningful for me to be at the Kennedy School. The real answer to the question of why do you get involved in politics, I don't think any of us does it for a specific reason. I think we're just drawn to it. It just seems like what we ought to be doing. And the reason I got drawn into it was really, I think, the leadership of John Kennedy. And when he was president, I think the feeling that a lot of us had, a lot of young people at that time, was that politics is a noble profession. And it's one that the best and brightest and most capable and the most dedicated young people in our country should be drawn to. And he had that effect on a lot of people that I was a contemporary of, and certainly had that effect on me. So to be at the Kennedy School is meaningful for me, and I look forward to a semester with all of you.
Thank you, Dan. Sitting to Dan's left is Joel Attinger, who is a correspondent with Time magazine, having served in Paris and Washington, now serving with the Boston Bureau. And Joel is teaching a student study group at the Institute this semester called The Limits of Dissent, the Press, and Social Change. Joel?
There's a very good reason why I never entered politics, at least being elected to public office, is that any kind of election I ever ran in, I lost. So I decided that the best way to get involved in politics was to observe. And I decided that through journalism that was probably the best means in which to do it, because I'm a terminal dilettante, so that while on the one hand you can observe political figures and how they make decisions, you can also look at art, you can also look at all kinds of various things. My decision to really come here was in many parts drawn and inspired, I think, by looking at how the political process works and how ideas get generated, who makes them. All my colleagues are really, with one exception, are decision makers, people clearly and closely aligned with the political process, and hopefully through them to learn a lot about how the process works. There is I'm blank, Jonathan, I'm sorry.
Tell us what kind of reporting, if you had your druthers, and whether you're working for Time magazine or not, that you'd like most to do. And would it be political reporting, or would it be other than political?
No, it is political reporting, but it's not so much the political structure as it is how ideas and issues and what people care about influence the political structure. And whether it is the new right or the evangelicals, and the importance of faith and the importance of hope and how that influences ideology, whether that's espoused by Jerry Falwell or Bernard Law or just a simple person among us. How those issues and how those ideas go from hope into part of legislation, to me, is what interests me. And it also, I've always been fascinated at how movements of change come from the bottom. I don't think they come from the top. And the press plays a key role in trying and not in trying, but in giving those voices, either through television or through the written medium, in giving those voices a chance to speak. And whether we choose to hear them or not is quite another matter. So my interest in journalism has really been to be part of that process, to bring ideas and to bring new, perhaps not new, but to bring issues to the fore so that people can debate them, think about them, and then decide for themselves what the course of a society should be.
Do you feel more motivated in your journalism towards influencing the policymakers in the decisions they make, or in influencing the people to be more enlightened, or maybe even more enlightened in the direction of what you consider enlightenment to be, so that they can influence the policymakers?
I think it's hard to divide the line. I think it's hard to draw the line, because I think that who exactly leads whom, I'm not exactly clear how that process works. I would say probably my initial bent would be to go towards to expose issues to the public and let them make up their mind, and hence let them obviously influence the decision makers. Working for a magazine like Time or any national publication, you inevitably influence the decision makers, because you are airing specific priorities, you are airing specific issues which they then have to pay attention to. So it's a fine line to draw, but my bent would be really to give and air issues which are not necessarily on the tip of everybody's tongue, but which should be thought about.
Do you have any, forgive me for this.
I'm much more comfortable with this. I think one of the problems as being an observer is that it's very hard to formulate, and I'm unaccustomed, I think, to presenting myself and making, so that's...
I don't have the privilege of asking questions very often.
Well, I'm glad to give you that.
Is there any special frustration or any special triumph that you've experienced while doing the kind of journalism you do? I mean, is there something that's happened to you since you've been working for Time magazine, because that's your employer, which has given you a special sense of desolation or frustration or a sense of failure, or is there something which you got special satisfaction out of in your work?
They're very, in fact, ironically, they're very linked. Probably my greatest satisfactions come from seeing stories but seeing issues as they're growing and being able to convince people that they're important, whether it be the evangelical right or whether it be the Frees, or when we're in Europe, basically the varieties of the variations within the Euro communist movement. But it's also the frustration, which is that the press is generally made up of very white, very upper middle class people, maybe not upper middle class, but we come from a very common ground. And I sometimes question our ability to fully reflect the diversity in our society and the diversity in the issues that we all care about. And a good press is one that reflects that diversity, and we have a long way to go.
Given your special interest in the evangelicals, which you've mentioned a couple of times, do you feel that, given the fact that over the last, well, maybe 4 years or 5 years, there's been much more media coverage of the evangelical or of the fundamental right, of the new right, particularly its involvement in American politics, do you think that there's a greater comprehension of the various issues involved in that movement or in that activity, very intense political activity, I would term it, on the part of the general citizenry? Or do you feel that it tends to be fairly polarized, and even though more people may be reacting and may hold opinions about the political activity of the evangelicals, it basically tends to reinforce prejudices or views, if not prejudices, that were held pretty much to begin with?
Mm-hmm. I think that the rise of the evangelical right has polarized because of the power that has accompanied the rise. I think that we as a people retain a deep belief in the privacy of religion and retain a deep belief feel uneasy when the line is crossed between private belief and policy. And to the degree that the evangelical right has sought to cross that line, that is where I think the polarization has arisen.
I'll resist the temptation to continue for the moment.
Okay.
Thank you, Joelle.
Thanks, Jonathan, for helping us.
Immediately on my right is Bill Winter, who has served as governor of the state of Mississippi and who is conducting an Institute of Politics study group entitled The South and the Nation this semester. Governor Winter.
As Jonathan Moore knows, I really had not planned to be here tonight, but the people of Mississippi had some other ideas, and instead of sending me to Washington, they sent me to Cambridge for a fourth-round draft choice, and the player to be announced later. And some of my reactionary friends in Mississippi think that you may deserve me having to put up with me for 4 months up here. But in any event, I may be the winner after all. This may be a lot more meaningful for me than to spent a few years in Washington as I had originally planned. But I have kicked around, as we say in Mississippi, in politics for a number of years. Kicked out now is a more proper description. But I began my political interests when I was a law student at Ole Miss. There were 16 of us who were members of the Mississippi legislature, who were students in the Ole Miss Law School. We had a caucus that met regularly. We even had an intramural football team. That was a heady experience to be a part of what seemed to be a very active, progressive period in Mississippi politics, which later deteriorated in the 50s and 60s. But we did begin, I think, with a great deal of idealism and with a sense of changing things for the better. Now, there are 2 or 3 things I learned fairly quickly, and that is that there are few straight lines in politics. The road is zigzag, to say the least. You go 2 miles down the road, and then you get kicked back 1.5 miles. but you pick yourself up and brush the dust off and go ahead. And this is the process by which progress is made. There was one other thing that I learned early on, and that is that among the most meaningful, challenging things that one does in politics is that involvement in the allocation of resources. We live in a great rich country. We used to think we had unlimited resources. Maybe we still do. Maybe we have lowered our sights in terms of what we think we have the capacity to do. But in a state such as I have represented and come from, the allocation of resources has special meaning. I come from a state with the lowest per capita income of any state in the nation. I come from a state where there are more truly poor people, dependent people, undereducated, underproductive people proportionally than in any other state. And so it is a very significant part of the political process for all of us who've been involved in it to determine how the limited resources are going to be allocated among the people. But it's not just in Mississippi, it's in the country, it's in the world. How do we divide up the bounty that we have available to us? That's part of the debate that's going on in Washington right now. How do we spend these billions of dollars that we have in the most productive way, in the way designed best to serve the long-term interests of the greatest number of people? Do we put them into missiles, or do we put those dollars into programs that will make people more self-sustaining and afford them a chance to lead more meaningful lives? I've always felt that, and I suppose the one motivating factor in my political career has lain in the area of education, of allocating resources on an increased amount to provide people with the means whereby they can use the talents that they have, not only to sustain themselves, but to be a part of the process of building better communities and a better country. But this is hard. This is the hardest job that any public official, any political officer has to tackle. Where do we make the allocation? Where do we draw the line? And I go back to an apocryphal story that could well have been true out of my first years as a young member of the Mississippi legislature, where one afternoon on the floor of the Mississippi House of Representatives, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee called up a bill to appropriate $20 million for the maintenance of the hospitals for the mentally ill. And before the clerk could finish reading the title of the bill, someone shouted, "Vote," and by a unanimous vote, the House voted $20 million for mental health. And so he went on to another bill to appropriate $17 million for the support of the penal institutions of the state, and the same procedure ensued, and everybody voted for the bill. In about 10 minutes, the House of Representatives of the Mississippi legislature had appropriated $75 million, and everybody had voted for all the bills, and there was no debate. And then the chairman of the local government committee got up and called up a bill to authorize the Board of Supervisors of Tishomingo County to spend $150 to pay a man, a farmer there, for a mule that had been killed when it had fallen through a defective bridge. 2 hours of debate ensued, and finally, by a vote of 65 to 64, the House defeated the bill on the ground that there wasn't a mule in Tishomingo County that was worth $150. And one of the young members of the legislature turned to one of his older senior colleagues and said, "Why is it now that in In about 15 minutes, we'll pass $75 million in bills authorizing appropriations for various purposes, and everybody will vote for the bill. Then we'll come around and spend 2 hours debating a bill for $150 and defeat the bill. And the old man said, maybe it's because we've gotten down to something we know something about. This points out the eternal problem that all of us have, and that is being able to apply the kind of hard value judgments in an intelligent, compassionate, meaningful way that will result in a better life for more people in this country. And I would like to talk about some of these things in specific detail as a part of the study group on the South and the nation.
Thank you, Bill. Next, Carlin Keene, sitting in between Rick and Lamond, who is the managing editor of the magazine Public Opinion, published at the American Enterprise Institute. Carlin will be teaching a study group this semester entitled Polls, The Legacy of George Gallup. Carlin.
Thank you, Jonathan. A few months ago, I saw a clip in the New York Times about Tom Hayden, and in picking up on the popular parlance, he referred to himself as a frumpy, a formerly radical, upwardly mobile young person. I'm not sure about the young anymore, but I certainly know that the upwardly mobile portion of that definition doesn't apply to someone who lives on a think tank salary. The formerly radical does apply to me for a very brief period in those turbulent times in the late 60s on the University of Wisconsin campus when we were all caught up in rioting against Dow Chemical's alleged complicity in the war in Vietnam. I hadn't thought much about those views and still have some pretty strong feelings about the war in Vietnam, but during my years at the University of Wisconsin, my political beliefs that weren't really very well formed began to evolve and change. And through a series of coincidences, I ended up in Washington early in 1971 looking for a job and felt very fortunate to be hired by Jim Buckley, conservative Republican senator from New York, as a receptionist. I stayed in that office for 6 years. There were about 20 young conservatives in that office at that time. We thought we were the only conservatives in the world, and I think we probably were. It was a very lonely time in Washington. And we watched a number of policy initiatives that might be familiar to some of you now go down in flaming defeat, things like deregulation of airlines, a bill that we proposed in 1971. We talked long ago about tuition tax credits, about indexation, and about enterprise zones, ideas that didn't get much of a hearing in Washington at that time. Nor did Jim Buckley, and I don't think there was a single piece of legislation, with the exception of the Buckley Privacy Amendment, which is giving universities all sorts of grief over the last few years, that was ever enacted into law. When Jim Buckley was defeated, I then went to work for another obscure group, a small PR firm from California called Deaver and Hannaford. At that time, they had just set up a Washington office, and there were only 2 of us in that office, again reflecting our numbers in Washington, and they asked me if I would be interested in doing some radio writing for some of their political clients. I wrote for Earl Butz, no jokes. I wrote for Bill Simon, who often called me an economic illiterate. I wrote for Virginia Nauer, who had a consumer column and still is a consumer advisor, and one of their other clients, someone named Ronald Reagan. I did have a hand in the pollution and trees column, but we can discuss that at another time. During that period, I met Ronald Reagan only once when I worked on perhaps his most unsuccessful speech in Washington, the Panama Canal speech in 1978 at the National Press Club. It wasn't well received at all, as you can imagine, but it was an interesting time. And through, again, a series of very fortunate coincidences, the person who shared my office at Deaver and Hannaford was a fellow named David Gergen, whom some of you may know from his fellowship here early in the last semester. Dave and I never knew one another at Deaver and Hannaford. He worked at night and I worked during the day. And he got to know me through the things I had on my walls and came to me one day and said there was a position open at AEI and would I consider taking a job there. And I've been following in his footsteps ever since. And as those of you who know him realize, it's a very hard act to follow. He brought me to AEI, and I felt extraordinarily fortunate to get in on the ground floor of a magazine called Public Opinion, and have spent a lot of time since then thinking about George Gallup, about public opinion polls, the permanent, another permanent feature of our permanent campaigns, and that's one of the things that I'd like to do in my seminar here. I've been in Washington for 15 years, and as I told my colleagues, I thought it was about time to see what the real world was like, so I've come here to the Kennedy Institute to learn from all of you. But that has been a particularly interesting time in Washington for somebody whose conservative beliefs were just beginning to develop in the Buckley office. I don't know sometimes what kind of a conservative I am, a paleo, a neo, a troglodyte, a new right nut, a right-wing nut, but it's interesting to have watched the evolution of a movement, to watch the players as they've grown, and to watch what happens when you have to assume the reins of government. In that very small staff that served Jim Buckley, a number of us have moved into the government. I was one who chose not to do that. Bill Schneider is Undersecretary of State for Arms Sales. Jackie Schaefer is a commissioner of the Council on Environmental Quality. Bill Gribben was the chief White House liaison for the Reagan administration in the first year. So it's a group that's been very, very interesting to watch. But I think watching a movement in terms of how it works when you're out of power and what kinds of tensions and frictions there are once you have to govern is a really very, very interesting experience. And I want to try to think about that when I'm here, and also to think further about George Gallup and about the role that polls have come to assume in our society. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, sitting all the way to your right, is Rick Hertzberg, who until recently has been editor of the New Republic and who is teaching.
Why does that get a laugh?
Well, get him while you can. And who is teaching a study group this semester on the opinion industry. Rick.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I don't really know any other way to tell why I'm in politics than to give you my life story. So I'll give you the 7-minute version. I've always been in politics one way or another, ever since I was a little 9-year-old know-it-all with thick glasses, going from door to door for Adlai Stevenson in 1952. But always from some weirdly angled, sideways kind of way. I was brought up in, not exactly as a red diaper baby, but it's sort of a red, white, and blue diaper baby. In my office here at the Institute, there's a letter that Norman Thomas wrote me when I was 6 weeks old, welcoming me into the world. And I was very lucky. I've been lucky all my life, and the first piece of luck I had was to have been born into a family and a house in which I was imbued with the political faith of the Democratic left. And in one way or another, I've never abandoned that faith. I grew up in a house where leaders of the Indian independence movement would traipse in and out of the house, people from the National Sharecroppers Union, exiles from the Spanish Civil War, exiles from the Soviet Union. And I was brought up on bedtime stories about Gandhi and Carlo Tresca and Eugene Debs and people like that. And then I had another stroke of luck. I came here. I was a member of the class of '65 at Harvard, and I arrived here when the Kennedy administration was 6 months old, and the dean of the faculty was the National Security Advisor in Washington, and the President of the United States was a member of the Board of Overseers. And I remember when he came to this spot for a Board of Overseers meeting, this was the MTA yards then, and said, "Here I will build my library." And this all seemed like the natural order of the world. And then November 22nd, 1963, put a stop to the natural order of the world and began the 1960s. And for me, the 1960s were, like, as they were for many other people, a kind of radicalizing experience, though, again, always within the context of this democratic left faith. I worked for a year for the National Student Association, which to me was an organization where you worked for $40 a week. It had backed the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It had fought against the House Un-American Activities Committee. And then it turned out to be a front organization for the Central Intelligence Agency. And I found that I had been made a dupe by the CIA, a very irritating, not to say embittering experience. My next stop in the 60s was the military. We had a character-building device in those days called the draft, and it forced you to confront extremely serious issues at an early age. There was no great merit in confronting those issues. Everyone in this room would confront them if they had to. The only reason I confronted them was that I had to. But I spent 2 years in the Navy and became a pacifist in the course of it, a conscientious objector. I'm no longer a conscientious objector, but I'm very glad I went through that experience. When I got out of the Navy, I spent a number of years as a journalist at the New Yorker magazine covering the events of the 60s. And I'll kind of fast forward here to 1977 when the Harvard Old Boy Network coughed me up in the White House. And I became one of Jimmy Carter's speechwriters, and for the last 2 years his chief speechwriter. I kept waiting in 60s style for my conscience to tell me that I was doing something terrible and working for the government, working for this in the White House, but it never happened. I mean, that was never a problem for Jimmy Carter's people. We may not have been the most competent collection of characters ever to run the country, but we tried to do right, and Jimmy Carter really did try to do right, and I think we'll be recognized at some point. It doesn't seem to be happening very quickly, but I think it eventually will happen, that he will be recognized for having done some things right. The last 4 years I've spent, again, another Harvard connection. Martin Peretz, my old government tutor, brought me to the New Republic as editor of the magazine. And there, as at the in the White House, I found myself the House lefty. But of course, the New Republic politics was taken much more seriously than it was in the White House. So I've had an opportunity in these past 4 years to observe at close quarters and in a small way participate in this struggle for the soul of liberalism. And I've watched such strange creatures as neoliberals and such truly strange creatures as neoconservatives fight each other, fight me. And I engaged in that battle so vociferously that now I find myself at the Institute of Politics. One way, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but one way or another, I hope it will be, I'm determined that it will be part of the same crooked path that I've followed all my life. And it's anybody's guess what my next move will be. Suggestions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Lamond Godwin, immediately on my left, is political strategy advisor to the Reverend Jesse Jackson and political director of the National Rainbow Coalition, and is teaching a study group at the Institute this semester called trends in political realignment? Are two parties enough? Lamont.
Thank you, Jonathan. What I'd like to do is talk very briefly about three things. First, when and how I became politically conscious. Secondly, when and why I became a serious political activist. And then finally, how I got here and what I'm doing now and what I plan to do in the future. I'm a native of Mobile, Alabama, and grew up in that state under conditions roughly similar to what we witness now in South Africa. I experienced very rigid racial discrimination, extreme segregation, schools, buses, graveyards, water fountains. And it was as a child in Alabama that I was forced to think about power and politics and how power was abused and how you change things. I remember very vividly a few events which really radicalized me. One was the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi, which shook me up in a very fundamental way because he was roughly the same age that I was, and although I knew about racism and discrimination, I was really shocked when this child was murdered by a racist mob, and it caused me to feel that the same thing could happen to me, and it caused me to take a serious interest in understanding what this was all about. And then a few years later, the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, in Alabama, where I was. Martin Luther King emerged as a leader of the black community in that state and later in the South and the nation. And then finally, after witnessing these events, I moved on to Atlanta as a college student in 1960, where for reasons I still don't understand, I was selected to be the only freshman to participate in the very first sit-in to desegregate lunch counters in Atlanta. And I remember going down to that demonstration fully convinced that this would be my last day on this earth. It's the worst feeling I ever had in my life, and at the same time, it was probably the most serious commitment I will ever have to make to anything as long as I live. I was prepared to die, and I thought it was the right thing to do, and I had pretty much prepared to go. As it turned out, it was not a tragedy. It turned out to be a fabulous success. Instead of getting killed, we made Time and Look and Newsweek and Life, and we became heroes. And we went back. And this experience caused me to develop a certain optimism and confidence about the ability to change things through deliberate, organized action that is still with me today and that influenced me for the rest of my life. Perhaps the most significant impact this had on me was that it convinced me that as long as I live, everything else I attempt to do will be easier than what I did then. And so when people questioned me and Jesse about running for president, don't you think this is an extremely difficult thing to do? No, this is easy compared to desegregating a lunch counter in the South in 1960. In fact, this is fun compared to that. And so I went on through undergraduate school, combining my studies at Clark College with various types of political activity, demonstrations. We desegregated Atlanta, and then we left Atlanta and went out into the rural South and desegregated the rural South. And most of the people who were student activists with me now control Atlanta, the entire city council, the state legislature, some of them are in the Congress, was a fantastic success from that point of view. So my first experience in politics was unrealistically fruitful and successful. And it's sort of been that way ever since. I came to Harvard in 1963, the summer school, as part of an effort to prepare to go and integrate the University of Alabama. My college paid my way here. Arthurine Lucy had attempted to integrate the school in the 50s, didn't work. A new assault was being planned with Vivian Malone and myself or somebody else. As it turned out, they selected somebody else to go, James Hood, in fact, with Vivian Malone to integrate the University of Alabama. And this precipitated George Wallace's famous stand in the school door in a showdown with John Kennedy. I was dating Vivian Malone, and they decided that since we were romantically involved, we wouldn't make a good protest team. And so Hood went, and I went on to finish my degree at Clark, and then won a fellowship to the University of Illinois, the Institute of Labor and Industrial Relations, where I pursued a degree in that field. And while there, I continued my protest activities and developed a style and an approach which enabled me to combine my interests in economics, politics, and civil rights protest activity in such a way that it became a model that I used over and over and over for the next 10 years. I designed research projects and administered them which combined the development of information which could be used to change public policy and fight discrimination. My first project involved a nationwide study of discrimination in the construction industry. I traveled all over the country, documenting discrimination in apprenticeship training programs. This information was used by the Labor Department to develop new regulations and training programs to break down those barriers and enable thousands of young black, Hispanic men, and then later women to enter these programs for the first time. I worked on this project and 6 consecutive research projects like it with Ray Marshall, who was at that time an economist on the faculty of the University of Texas. So for the next 10 years, Ray Marshall and I did a series of research and action projects developing information to fight job discrimination in various sectors. The last project we did together was one involving the development of an affirmative action program for the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway Development Project, which was the largest construction project in the history of the country. We were fighting the Labor Department to get them to do what needed to be done to correct employment discrimination there. This was during the Nixon administration. They were reluctant to do what we were trying to get them to do. Then along came 1976, and overnight we went from outside agitators to being the Secretary of Labor and the Special Assistant to the Secretary of Labor in the Carter administration. And I was given the authority to implement all affirmative action programs for the U.S. government nationwide, and needless to say, it took about a month to get an affirmative action program for that Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway project. From that, I went on to a series of assignments inside the Carter administration, the Labor Department, on the White House Interagency Coordinating Council, and then finally in 1980, when Carter lost the election, I came out, went to work with my friend Jesse Jackson as his political advisor, and I worked for the Rockefeller Foundation as a consultant and helped them design and implement a series of projects totaling $10 million to assist economically disadvantaged people. And then as we approached 1983, 1984, I had the assignment of helping Jesse decide how to prepare for this upcoming political season. We got involved in the Harold Washington contest. We actually organized a voter registration drive in that city. And we had to organize a voter registration drive to convince Harold to run. He was reluctant to do it, so we had to recruit him and convince him to run. It turned out to be a very successful drive. He did run, and you know what happened. Coming out of that experience, we had learned several things. One, and probably the most important thing we learned, is that we faced problems on all sides. It was not only the problem of Ronald Reagan, but we faced serious problems inside the Democratic Party. Harold Washington, in his effort to become mayor, had to compete against Fritz Mondale, Ted Kennedy, a lot of other powerful Democrats who campaigned against him. We encountered all kinds of problems as we set out to register blacks in the South, and we found ourselves, in effect, surrounded by hostile Democrats and Republicans. And one of the things we learned from our civil rights experience is that whenever you're surrounded, there's only one thing to do, and that is attack. And so we decided to attack. And we developed the strategy of running as a candidate inside the Democratic Party in the Democratic primary as a way to force the kinds of reforms that that party needed to make, as a way to raise the kind of issues that we did not think would be raised in the campaign, as a way to increase the participation of people we knew would not participate if they had to choose between Reagan and Mondale. And that led to a series of events which brings us now to the decision about what to do in the wake of this campaign for the president. And we have decided that we're going to convert our campaign machinery into a permanent national political organization we call the Rainbow Coalition. And not just because it is the politically expedient thing to do, but this is our way of continuing the work of our hero, Martin Luther King, because he succeeded in building a Rainbow Coalition in the 1960s, and that's exactly what the March on Washington was. We don't think it is at all strange to believe that we can build a new progressive political movement like he did and bring together whites, blacks, and others, because we saw it happen before. So in many ways, what we're attempting to do now is a logical conclusion of what we started as sit-in protest leaders in the 60s. His experience parallels mine. And we're now about the business of, once again, developing the kind of information we need to develop a viable strategy to attack a series of important problems that we hope to solve through our new progressive political organization that we call the Rainbow Coalition. And that's why I'm at Harvard, and that's what I'll be working on while I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Now, we would be delighted to take questions, and when you ask the question, could you please speak clearly so that everybody in the room can hear you, and could you address your question towards the member of the panel that you'd most like to answer it? Sir.
In the spirit of spilling your guts out, I'm told that even the smallest politician, even when he's knocked down to the lowest level, when his shirt is ripped off his chest, there's a presidential shield on his chest. I was wondering if Daniel Whitehurst, William Winter, and Lamont Godwin might explain their aspiration and how they might achieve it.
Well, I guess I got into politics because I thought it'd be easier to break into than showbiz, and my ultimate goal was either to be a game show host or president of the United States. And, you know, As far as an ultimate ambition, I guess my being here is might be interpreted to some extent as an admission that I'm not sure what it is. I think it's true that a lot of us in politics do sort of fantasize about. Well, the Oval Office would be just about the right shape for me, but I have come to a feeling of, I guess my being here is almost a rejection of the notion that the idea of being in politics is to hop from bird perch to bird perch and keep going up until you make it to the top of the civics class chart. And I felt it would be good to get off the treadmill for a while and just stop and think about things. Being in political office is not a whole lot different from a lot of other jobs in this respect. You really don't have time to reflect and to study and to think and to converse, other than as it relates to solving some current problems that you're dealing with. I do hope to get back into politics. I expect I'll be running for elective office again. I am now old enough to be president, which is why I haven't been president already, I guess. So we'll see where it goes.
What elective office?
What elective office?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it would be too presumptuous to talk about a presidential campaign for me at this point. Governor of California would be. I think it's a fine job.
I didn't find any overwhelming interest in the state of Mississippi for me to go to Washington in any capacity last year, so I think realism dictates that I stick to what I'm doing right now, and that is to enjoy a role outside the elective political field, hopefully using some of the experience that I have gained, for better or worse, as a result of having run for office, having held various public offices, and being instrumental in encouraging folks that I see here in this room and your contemporaries over this country in getting into the political process and finding there the kind of challenge, the kind of satisfaction that I found in it. As I indicated a few minutes ago, I hope you won't expect too much in terms of immediate results. Politics is a long, frustrating process, and the one quality that I think is, as most of us, worth his salt, her salt, holding public office, could probably make considerably more money outside the public sector.
Except Rick.
What you have not mentioned, and what I think ought to be mentioned here, is not, from a standpoint of money, is not what you give up or what you get by virtue of being in public office, but the greatest threat, I think, to our political structure right now is the cost of running for public office. And to ask the question, where does that money come from? I have just completed an unsuccessful race for the United States Senate in the state of Mississippi, which, as I said a while ago, has the lowest per capita income of any state in the nation. I raised and spent about $1 million. Now, that was as much money as I raised and spent in being elected governor 5 years ago, and yet I was outspent in this race for the United States Senate by my opponent, who spent some $3 million. This is the concern that I have about the elected political process. It's not what we make or what we miss the opportunity to make individually. It's the cost of running for office and the sources of financial support that are involved if one seeks public office.
Dan, do you have any comment on the question? I mean, if the problem isn't as great as the questioner suggested, is it because people don't do all that badly financially in public service, or because the people who are attracted to public service, money doesn't mean all that much to them?
Well, I think most people.
Now, you've got a family that you're raising. Presumably, you'd like them to go to college. I mean, is this a factor in your own decision?
Yeah, it is. I think there are. First of all, the people who are in public office have, to a great extent, somehow solved the problem of either they don't have a desire to make a lot of money, or somehow they have solved the financial problem for themselves. I think a lot of good people are discouraged from entering public office in the first place because of the fact that it is difficult financially today to hold public office, especially, and a lot of it is, I guess your demand for income is to a great extent, after you get past satisfying the basic needs, your demand for income is perhaps a relative thing and a psychological thing, but a lot of public officials, very candidly now, they're dealing on a daily basis with people who are earning $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year, and in California, for instance, California has one of the highest paid legislatures in the country. I think legislators in California make about $35,000, $40,000 a year, something like that. Let's say that legislator has a child who wishes to go to Harvard, and it must cost at least $500, $600 a year now to go to Harvard, right? It is a factor, and I'll be candid with you that one of the things that one of the factors that I weighed in making the decision not to seek a third term as mayor was the fact that I felt we have little kids who are now in elementary school, and I felt it important for me to take a little time outside of public office and somehow generate the financial resources so that I can provide for that kind of, my wife and I together can provide for that kind of financial security for our family, and I want to be able to do enough of that so that I can comfortably go back in and not have that be a major consideration. But I do think that's a very major issue, and the good part of it is that through some means or another, there are a lot of very capable people who are willing to make that financial sacrifice. But I think it's in the interest of the country to address the problem, because I think a lot of good people are not able to get into public life because of that.
Way up top, yes. That's not heavy. Rick, do you want to start?
Well, to me, politics is simply a democracy, and to the extent that a country is democratic, it has politics, and to the extent that it's not democratic, it has no politics. That's why I'm glad to. I'm interested in politics, so I'm glad I live in a democracy. It's the way. I'm not sure this is going to be an answer to your question, because I'm not totally sure what your question is. But I'll give you this. I will say this about politicians. I think that on the whole, politicians are a little bit better than the average run of people. And if you take a statistical sample of citizens, and then you, very popular view. And the reason is it touches on what we've just been talking about, and that somewhere in back of of the mind of everybody who goes into politics is, however remote it may now be, and however overlayered with egomania and greed and so on, there is some kernel of a desire to serve the public, or at least to look like you're serving the public. And the other thing about politicians is this, and I'm speaking not as a politician now, because the politicians at this table are the ones who have run for office. A politician may have a big ego, but a politician is willing to do something that the rest of us are not willing to do, and that is to put that ego out on the table to be rejected by enormous numbers of people, to take a risk that most of us are not willing to take. And that's what makes, to me, that's what makes politicians interesting people, and that's why I enjoy being around them, and that's why I admire them.
I don't think it's just a democracy that has politics. I guess that's where I would disagree with Rick, but in that I think we're all part of the political. We're all politics. It's how we govern ourselves and all the many facets that entails, whether it's through local government, whether it's a body such as this, your Student Advisory Committee. And that's what makes it so fascinating, because it is so multidimensional, and it perhaps one of the problems that we face, I think, as a society is that because as an American society we are so individualistic, we don't like a structure to tell us how to do things. And I don't think that we have recompensed those among us who are willing to put their egos, their ideas, and their hopes and dreams on the line and ask us to vote for them. And we don't recompense them, I think, properly enough for the kinds of risks and devotion, I think, that they show to the process, and some of them to their own egos, obviously. It's nice to get elected, but they do risk a negative vote. So your question about what is politics, I think you need to look around you, and there's not any simple answer. It's many, many facets.
Yes, politics is a strange hybrid. And for me, I've always found it useful to think of politics conceptually as a process that involves, focuses on the allocation of power. Power is defined quite simply the ability to cause or prevent change despite opposition. Politics is a process through which questions about power and how it is allocated among the various groups involved in the political process, how those decisions get made. It's always been more useful for me to focus on power as a central concept, and power as the ability to cause or prevent change, than politics, which is simply the process or the collection of activities that impact upon the allocation of this ability to cause or prevent change, control, so forth.
Thank you. Bill, do you have something to add about defining what politics is to you?
Simply one additional comment about it. There are a great many people who pride themselves in not being a part of the political process. First time I ever ran for public office, I ran for the legislature from my home county. I went to the person in the county that I thought was probably in the best position to be influential in helping me be elected. He was the president of the local bank. And I went into his office, and he let me know very quickly that politics was one thing that he did not participate in, and he would have no part of any political campaign. I went across the street, and there was a fellow whittling in front of the courthouse. And I pressed my campaign on him, and he was immediately interested, had no property interest, but he had a lot of friends. That man helped me get elected. after I became state representative from Grenada County, I looked to my whittling friend there in front of the courthouse for counsel and direction rather than the man that would have been in a much more likely position to be helpful, the local banker. What I'm simply saying is that we participate in politics actively or passively or not at all, but the results of our active or passive or non-participation still affect the way we live, the way we do business, the kind of communities that we have. None of us under our system of government in this country is immune from the effects and the decisions of politicians in the political process. We may think we're not a part of it, but by not being involved, we may be contributing as much to the results as if we were actively involved in it. What I'm simply saying is there's no escape for any of us living in this country from the effects of political decisions, and we ignore that participation at our peril.
Thank you. I'd like to close by asking Carlin Keene a question, and I'm going to steal into a study group which Lamont Godwin is teaching, which you may remember was on realignment. I don't think that Lamont Godwin's notion about realignment is implicit in the kind of realignment I'm about to ask Carlin Keene about. To wit, does she think that 1988 and beyond will bring the kind of historical realignment away from the old Roosevelt New Deal coalition and towards a more conservative, originally Kevin Phillips, now manifested in Ronald Reagan's political ideology across the country? Do you think that a political realignment that we're in the middle of one that is going to continue in 1988 and into the future?
I think to some extent the political realignment has already happened. The Republicans now have an opportunity and a lot of possibilities to make that a permanent realignment. But as I look ahead to 1988, I think I would say at this point that I think the Democrats may have the stronger field. And that comes at an odd time when you have a column in the Wall Street Journal this morning and all the other papers about the bitter fighting and factionalism within the Democratic ranks as they pick a new party chairman. It's always been my impression that when you hear those stories of sounding the death knell of a political party or writing the obituaries of a political party, it's just about that time that party's beginning to get its act together again and to revive. And as I look across the spectrum, I think the Republicans, despite their extraordinary strength in the Electoral College, are a little divisive public opinion, what we call the R squared and F squared. All those states won by Reagan twice, Nixon twice, and Ford are already 202 of the 270 necessary votes in the Electoral College. That's an incredibly strong base for a party to move ahead with in electoral politics. But right now, just looking at the candidates, I think the Democrats might have a stronger field.
But does that imply that you think that the candidates that are fielded are more important than the ideas which they represent?
Oh, I think it's both.
So it's jerked around. It can be jerked around one presidential election to the next. Doesn't have anything to do with any continuity of political philosophy.
Oh, I think it's both. I mean, in this way, this has sort of been a schizoid realignment with many different personalities and many different levels in terms of political applications. But I think, in particular in the economic arena, the ideas, a lot of those that have been advanced by Republicans and a lot of other Democrats there, you may not see the economic issue being as strong if Reagan is as fortunate, I think, in some ways as he's been in the last 4 years, and you begin to ask yourself what other issues might be the issues of a campaign in '88. I mean, will it be foreign policy again? Will it be religion and politics? Will it be all of those things? And, of course, ideas will be very important in that, but leadership is still a very elusive and key dimension to the whole thing.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panel members and you, the audience, for coming tonight, and you're welcome to the reception over in the Institute of Politics.